good happens every day in the public school system. People created in the image of God are capable of good, but that doesn't equal that the whole system exists for good, for something that we should be proud of and we should seek to preserve. No, it does not. All right, family and friends, my name is John Rushemeza. This is the CounterRevolution Podcast. Thank you so much for joining me today. The purpose of this podcast is to unpack the subject of education and to equip Christians to think biblically about education, which is discipleship, in today's culture. My desire, my dream, my hope, my prayer is that we can together redeem, reform, and reclaim all education as a ministry of the family, first and foremost, and the local church. And the family, obviously, the Christian family is part of the local church. And the local church, according to the scriptures, according to 1 Timothy 3:15, is the foundation and pillar of truth. And you cannot have education without truth. You cannot have knowledge without truth. And of course, we as Christians, we are told from the scriptures that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. Jesus is the Logos, the one who holds everything together by the power of his word. Jesus is the Logos made flesh. He is God in the second person, the creator of the heavens and the earth. And so Christians should be the educators of the culture, not the other way around. To that end, today I wanted to talk about a subject that's been on my heart for some time now, and that is the subject of critical pedagogy. Now, critical pedagogy is an offspring, or is the education arm of critical theory. And so critical theory, Neo-Marxism, or cultural Marxism as it is known, gave birth to a bunch of different children. Some of them are critical race theory, gender studies, queer theory, and all these other different theories that are all part of the same kind of soup that is what is known today as cultural Marxism. But before I go there, I want to address something from the top here, and that is that there's this notion among Christians that the public school system is a good that has to be reformed, that abandoning the public school system is wrong and unchristian, that we must instead reform it. We must instead go in there, shine the light, bring reformation into it, to bring it back to what it once was, which is a neutral institution that, yes, has the Bible in it and prayer, but that is teaching, doing good in society today. I want to point out that those who make that claim, those who want us to believe that this is a noble task, do not understand where the public school system came from and how it came to be as we have it today. They do not understand the history of the public school system. Is that to say the public school system hasn't done any good? Of course not. Good happens every day in the public school system because there are humans there are Christians there, but you know, people created in the image of God are capable of good, but that doesn't equal that the whole system exists for good, for something that we should be proud of and we should seek to preserve. No, it does not. The public school system from the get-go was established and promoted to undermine the church, to undermine the hold or that Christianity had on this culture. And in part, the cultural elites feared that the people might turn against them to start demanding for them to stop abusing their power, stop concentrating power and wealth amongst themselves. So there's a paper that I recently found from a lady named Agustina Paglian. I hope I'm saying the name right. But Agustina wrote an article in 2022 published in the American Political Science Review. Agustina Paglian is a professor at the University of California, San Diego, I believe in political science. I could be mistaken on that. But I think out of this paper, she developed a book, which is, the book is titled Raised to Obey. But this paper is called Education or Indoctrination? ? Then the subtitle, The Violent Origins of Public School Systems in an Era of State Building. So she does a deep dive in this paper to make the claim, basically, that there's a reason, a number of reasons that the government, we have a government school systems today. Early on, in the early to mid 1800s, this country is only a few, maybe about almost 100 years old. The people started looking for a way to control the population. And so Ms. Paglian here does a deep dive. She has a lot of sources to corroborate her claims. And she says this early on in her article. She says, this article develops a theory of mass education as a state building tool that is deployed in response to internal conflict and offers evidence, this paper, it offers evidence for it from the development of public primary education systems in Europe and Latin America. I argue, she says, she argues that influenced by the frightening experience of internal conflict involving mass violence against the state, national elites expanded public primary schooling to indoctrinate, I repeat, to indoctrinate future citizens to accept the status quo, hoping that this would help the state carry out its most essential function, which is to prevent social disorder and ensure political stability. So a noble cause, if you will. But that quote right there is going to be important for us down the road as we talk about critical pedagogy, because as you can see here, this is early, again, early 1800, early to mid 1800s. This is the times of Horace Mann and others back then in Massachusetts who are looking for a way to do something. Again, Ms. Paglian believes that this is because looking at what was happening in Europe and in South America, the social elites started to be concerned about their own status and the situation here in their own context here in America. And so they moved to do exactly what the people in Europe and Latin America were doing. Again, the national elites, according to Ms. Paglian, again, the national elites expanded public primary schooling to indoctrinate future citizens to accept the status quo, hoping that this will help them carry out their most essential function, which is to prevent social disorder and to ensure political stability. In other words, they couldn't trust the home and the church, who were the ones providing the most education at the time. They simply couldn't be trusted. An education controlled by each community on their own without government involvement could not be trusted, because what are they teaching those children over there? They could be training them as an army to rise up against us, to cause problems, to cause a revolution. So they wanted a system, a government, central system to control how people are educated everywhere. Again, Ms. Paglian is saying that her argument that she's making, which is the state building argument, has two parts. First, political elites must believe that primary schooling can insist moral values and behaviors of obedience, discipline, and respect for authority that will consequently reduce future probability of mass rebellion against the established order. Second, this idea will gain political traction following episodes of acute internal conflicts and social disorder, when increased fear over a distribution of power from elites to the masses helps forge a coalition of elite support for proposals to create and expand a mass education system. So Ms. Paglian then proceeds to make this case on these 2 points, that the elites were afraid that the people could rise up, and the elites believed that if they created a system of education, the system of education could actually help them better indoctrinate and control people by teaching them what to do, what not to do, how to behave in polite society, and so on and so forth. So again, without going too much into this because I wasn't here to talk about this subject in total. I will do one day another episode just to dive into this paper more deeply. I just wanted to point out that the system that we have is not broken. It's operating as intended. It's this, we're having the logical conclusion that once the elites put this system in place, this is what was bound to happen. Again, just not to belabor this point a lot, people like Horace Mann, basically not really Christians. He was a Unitarian, so he was not a Christian. Wanted a system that would instill patriotism, that would instill some values. So he was going to borrow some things from Christianity, but without Christ. And they wanted a system that would help them control the population, educate them to a level so they can participate in the things that they needed them to participate in, but not too much that they can rival them. So again, the lady here, Ms. Paglian, says that primary school proponents argued basically that the primary schools would foster long-term order through 3 main mechanisms. First, schools could convince the masses from a young age to be content with what they had, teaching values of moderation and self-sacrifice, inculcating the belief that happiness resulted from accepting one's lot, were common goals of primary schools throughout the 19th century. Second, schools could shape behaviors by instilling fear of punishment for misbehavior, or conversely by promoting rewards for proper behavior. Stealing, vandalism, quarreling, cheating, lying, cursing were typically punished, as were questioning the teacher, speaking out of turn, disobeying school rules or teachers' instructions. Sitting quietly and completing tasks as instructed were praised publicly. School punishments and rewards sought to teach children that their behavior had consequences and that obedience, compliance, and respect for existing rules and authorities were in their own best interest. Third, proponents argued that schools could cultivate unconscious habits of compliance and deference simply through repetition. The mere act of attending school every day and following schedules, routines, and rituals like marching in silence from classroom to break room would make individuals internalize from a young age what constituted good manners and civil behaviors. Okay, let's stop there. First, we said here from the start that education is discipleship. You cannot escape that. And even there, you just heard from the start, she's making the case that these were the goals from the start. This is, we're talking well over 100 years ago, almost 200 years ago in this country. She's talking about these elites looking to disciple children, which is what we're still doing today. No one wants to admit it. Well, not no one. Some people don't want to admit this, but this is in fact the reality. Now, this is early enough in America that the majority of people are Christians, born again, committed Christians in this country, Protestants to be specific. But the social elites had to convince the Christians that this was a good system for the good of the country, for the good of society. Everything I just read, all Christians want that. And if you told me you have a way for me to make this happen on a mass level, I would see it as a gift from God. Except this was not a gift from God. This was deception from the start. This was the elites trying to play God. In the same way the elites continue to try to play God today by convincing parents that the education system is neutral, or that it can be neutral, and that all they have to do is disciple their children at home, instill these values in them at home, and that the school can then go and teach them to read, write, and do mathematics. But of course, that was never the goal to begin with. So now let's pivot to critical pedagogy. I'm going to read some definitions because I want to give the definitions from the proponents themselves. I want to make sure that those people who hold to this theory of education can speak for themselves. So according to the library at charlotte.edu, J. Murray Atkins Library, they say this: critical pedagogy. Critical pedagogy is based in critical theory. Critical pedagogy connects the concepts of critical theory with education. Then they give a quote. Many critical theories, this is a quote, many critical theories have emerged in connection with the many social movements that identify varied dimensions of the domination of human beings in modern society. In both the broad and the narrow sense, however, critical theory provides the descriptive and normative basis for social inquiry aimed at decreasing domination and increasing freedom in all their forms. They go on to say, quote, critical pedagogy originates especially from the work of Paulo Freire, an educator and philosopher whose work, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, formed the basis for critical pedagogy. Critical pedagogy overlaps with pedagogies such as feminist pedagogy, anti-racist pedagogy, and inclusive pedagogy. These three pedagogies strongly pull from key theories introduced by critical pedagogy. Okay, they go on to say, quote, critical pedagogy identifies education as being inherently political and therefore not neutral. Critical pedagogy encourages students and instructors to challenge commonly accepted assumptions that reveal hidden power structures, inequities, and injustice in society. They continue, quote, critical pedagogy acknowledges education is political. Education has a history of inequalities, oppression, and domination that need to be recognized. Likewise, education can become a way in which students are equipped to engage against a system of oppression when existing structures in education are challenged. A central tenet of pedagogy maintains that the classroom, curricular, and school structures teachers enter are not neutral sites waiting to be shaped by educational professionals. And I would agree with that last quote 100%. The system is not something neutral that is just waiting for some. No. Nobody, nothing is neutral. Everything bends one way or another. All right, another definition. According to Miss Jamila Gabrielle, she is a critical pedagogy research librarian at the Gatman Library. And this particular article is posted in the Harvard Library, Harvard Graduate School of Education. She said, quote, to the question, what is critical pedagogy? She said, and I quote, one working definition of critical pedagogy is that it is an educational theory based on the idea that schools typically serve the interests of those who have power in society. Now, I want you to remember back from what we read from Ms. Paglian, and then let's turn back to what she's saying here. Okay? She believes, and the critical pedagogues believe, that according to critical pedagogy, schools, government schools, typically serve the interest of those who have power in a society by usually unintentionally perpetually unquestioned norms for relationships, expectations, and behaviors. Based on critical theory, it was first theorized in the US in the 70s by the widely known Brazilian educator Paulo Freire in his canonical book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, but has since taken on a life of its own in its application to all facets of teaching and learning. The pedagogy of the oppressed, or what we know today to be the basis for critical pedagogy, is described by Freire as, quote, a pedagogy which must be forged with, not for, the oppressed, whether individuals or peoples, in the incessant struggle to regain their humanity. This pedagogy makes oppression and its causes objects of reflection by the oppressed, and from that reflection will come their necessary engagement in the struggle for liberation. And in the struggle, this pedagogy will be made and remade, an instrument for their critical discovery that both they and their oppressors are manifestations of dehumanization. Ms. Jamila then goes on to say, perhaps a more straightforward definition of critical pedagogy is a radical approach to education that seeks to transform oppressive structures in society using democratic and activist approaches to teaching and learn. She ends with, quote, there are many applications of theory-based pedagogy that privilege minoritarian thought, such as anti-racist pedagogy, feminist pedagogy, engaged pedagogy, culturally sustaining pedagogy, and social justice, to name a few. Again, these are the very words of the proponents themselves. These are not my words. This is what they believe. Teachers' colleges here in America, in North America, are enamored with critical pedagogy. When she called the book from Paulo Freire canonical, basically some have even claimed that this book is mandatory reading in most of the colleges. That she says a widely known Brazilian educator. Most Christians don't know who this guy is. If you're not a nosy guy like me, and if you're not a teacher that went to college and that was meant to read that book, most people don't know who this guy is. But his theories has done more damage in the last 30 to 40 years in this country. Why? Because at some point, the people that became elites now wanted to destroy this country. Originally, the elites wanted to preserve this country, which is why they started the public school system. They wanted to preserve this country, but more importantly, they wanted to preserve control. They wanted to keep the people at bay. Eventually, probably starting in the 50s and 60s, those who became elites, those who became the cultural elites, those who took over the ivory towers of institutions of higher learning, colleges and universities, became the radicals. And by the way, for the most part, it is thanks to a guy named Henry Giroux, because Henry Giroux is the one who took Paulo Freire's ideas and put them on steroids. It was Henry Giroux who took critical pedagogy to unimaginable heights. Henry Giroux is the chair for scholarship in the public interest at McMaster University, Canada, and the Paulo Freire Distinguished Scholar in Critical Pedagogy. Throughout his life, this is a little biography. Throughout his life, Henry Giroux has sought to develop critical theory of evolution, emphasizing crucial intersections between the role of education in schools and universities with that of culture and public life. His vision of critical pedagogy advocates for the need to make pedagogy central to politics itself and to help create conditions necessary for the development of a formative culture that provides the foundation for developing critical citizens and a meaningful and substantive democracy. Henry Giroux is a Marxist, and he, again, has been very instrumental in popularizing critical pedagogy in this country. So just as a recap before we continue, critical pedagogy is a neo-Marxist philosophy of education that is aiming to dismantle oppressive structures such as capitalism, patriarchy, traditional morality, etc. When they say critical, they're not talking about critical thinking. They're talking about deconstruction and to overthrow. The idea of critical consciousness is basically an awakening, a spiritual awakening, which, according to New Discourses by James Lindsay, critical consciousness describes how oppressed or marginalized people learn to critically analyze their social conditions and act to change them. He says critical consciousness is composed of three components: critical reflection, political efficacy, and critical action. Knowledge of critical consciousness and its component parts helps youth practitioners and scholars facilitate the process and expand the understanding of the concept. Critical reflection refers to a social analysis and moral rejection of societal inequities such as socio-economic, racial, ethnic, and gender inequities that constrain well-being and human agency. Again, quote, critical consciousness is, in short, having adopted a critical mindset in the sense of critical theories It is to have taken on a worldview that sees society in terms of systems of power, privilege, dominance, oppression, and marginalization, and that has taken up an intention to become an activist against these problematics. To have developed a critical consciousness is to have become aware, in light of this worldview, that you are either oppressed or an oppressor, or at least complicit in oppression as a result of your socialization into an oppressive system. To have a critical consciousness is to be aware of and generally unhappy about your positionality in society, i.e., your relationship to systemic and institutional power as determined by theory and based mostly on facts concerning what demographic groups you are a part of. We can go on and on about this, but you get the drift. So to achieve a critical consciousness, you have to go through a process called conscientization. And conscientization is a term that was coined by Paulo Freire, again, and that is basically, according to the Freire Institute, conscientization is the process of developing a critical consciousness of the social and political forces that shape our lives and developing a critical thinking skills to challenge injustice and create change. Now listen up, listen closely. Quote, "This is not simply an intellectual process or a moment of enlightenment, but one that presupposes an ongoing commitment to action. Nor is it an individual process. We discover and seek to change reality through our collective activity. The concept is a difficult one as it is often misused by people who treat it as an intellectual process." Paulo Freire says that we all acquire social myths which have a dominant tendency, and so learning in a critical process which depends upon uncovering real problems and actual needs. Again, I want to revisit that part one more time. Conscientization, the process of developing a critical consciousness, is not simply an intellectual process or a moment of enlightenment, but one that presupposes an ongoing commitment to action. In other words, you have to be changed and transformed. You have to be transformed by the renewing of your mind. In other words, we're talking about a spiritual transformation. Now, I just quoted in part Romans 12, but this conscientization applies it in a counterfeit way, in a secular humanistic kind of way. So again, this, my friends, is critical pedagogy. As I said already, it is a counterfeit religion. You get converted through conscientization and achieving a critical consciousness. Basically, when you achieve a critical consciousness, that means you have been fully transformed and changed from the inside out. Critical pedagogy is also discipleship, of course, and it's training children to become activists. It's indoctrinating children into becoming, training children to hate themselves, to hate their country, to hate their heritage, and to go after it, to seek to destroy it. The critical part of critical theory and critical pedagogy is not your traditional critical thinking, where you're critically thinking and breaking things down to seek understanding. This kind of critical thinking is deconstruction and destruction. This kind of critical thinking seeks to destroy and do away with. And so they have to indoctrinate children. They have to create guilt through gaslighting and manipulation to turn them against their own parents, against their own culture, against their own heritage. You ever met a white person that is really guilty, that feels like it is their God-given assignment to fight the power on behalf of the marginalized? They have been influenced. They are going through the process of conscientization. The Bible in Colossians 2:8, it says, and I quote, "See to it that no one takes you captive through hollow and deceptive philosophy, which depends on human tradition and elemental spiritual forces of this world rather than on Christ." My friends, I promise you, critical pedagogy is that which we're being warned against. It is an empty and hollow and deceptive philosophy. And it depends on human traditions. It depends on elemental spirits, counterfeit spirits, rather than on Christ. Whenever they bring about Christ, and they do, because Paulo Freire is also a liberation theologian, but his Jesus is not my Jesus. His Jesus does not resurrect from the dead. His Jesus does not confront sin. His Jesus does not send people to hell, those people that reject him. And his Jesus does not atone for anyone's sin. His Jesus was a revolutionary socialist that was killed by the government because he dared to fight the power. Totally different Jesus. So, the Bible calls us to see to it that no one takes us captives through hollow and deceptive philosophy. Critical pedagogy, critical theory, critical race theory is a hollow and deceptive philosophy. And yes, it does depend on human traditions and elemental spiritual forces, not on Christ. Now, one of the ways that critical pedagogy is applied is through what is known as SEL, or social and emotional learning. Now, of course, after 2020, social and emotional learning, CASEL, rebranded SEL to now transformative social and emotional learning. Here's what they say it's about. According to CASEL, transformative SEL is committed to advancing equity and excellence in education through social and emotional learning. Social and emotional learning is founded on the premise that every child can receive an education that fully supports their learning and development so they can achieve their goals and contribute to communities. Unfortunately, they continue, unfortunately, some students are not currently experiencing opportunities and environments that maximize their learning potential. Patterns across all types of educational data show differences in students' learning experiences and outcome based on students' social and emotional, socioeconomic status, race, zip code, home language, disability status, and other factors. Okay, they go on to justify transformative social and emotional learning. By the way, CASEL stands for Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning. It is a wicked organization, but that has influence on every school in this country and probably around the world. Every government school, not some Christian schools as well. But according to them, this is their baby. They are the go-to person for social and emotional learning. Anywhere you hear and see social and emotional learning, just know that CASEL is there somewhere. They said this: transformative SEL is a form of SEL implementation where young people and adults build strong, respectful, and lasting relationships to engage in core learning. It facilitates critical examination of individual and contextual factors that contributes to inequities and collaborative solutions that lead to personal, community, and societal well-being. Through TSEL, students and adults develop social and emotional skills needed for school and community engagement, with a focus on rights and responsibilities for creating learning environments that are caring and just. You get the drill, I hope, because SEL and now TSEL is in every school, in every subject. You cannot opt out of it. Another ways in which critical pedagogy is applied is through curriculum, and some of the schools are actually outrightly going after it. And one of the examples that I realized recently was actually exposed in the recent case that went through the Supreme Court, Mahmoud v. Taylor. In Mahmoud v. Taylor, the case, those who might not know this, was a case in which the people in Montgomery County, Maryland, Montgomery County public school system or school district or whatever, decided that they were not going to allow parents to opt out of a class that was teaching using LGBT inclusive material. So Mahmoud, I think, is a Muslim, but he had some allies that were Christians. They decided to push back against the school. The state there in Maryland, the state Supreme Court sided with the school district, so they ended up with the highest court, and so they won the case there. And again, according to Justice Samuel Alito, in his majority opinion, he said this: according to an email that was sent by the MCPS principals, the board selected the books according to a critical selection repertoire. And that repertoire required selectors to review potential texts and ask questions such as, is heteronormativity reinforced or disrupted? Now, you're wondering, what is heteronormativity? Okay. According to a website called simplypsychology.org, heteronormativity is the overall assumption that everyone is straight and based on the conception that there are only two genders. In other words, the Bible, or just traditional understanding of anyone. It is the idea that romantic and sexual relationships are always, I would add, should always be between one man and one woman. Heteronormativity does not accurately reflect the reality that gender exists on a spectrum and that there are only two genders. Heteronormativity presumes heterosexuality is the default sexual orientation, thus erasing other sexual identities, and can lead people to misgender someone, such as referring to someone with the wrong pronouns. With that definition, we go back to Mahmoud v. Taylor, Justice Alito's majority opinion. The school district, using what is known as a critical selection repertoire, the people had to select the books, and as they selected the books, they were asking these questions. Is heteronormativity reinforced or disrupted? Now, I believe with all my heart, and so should you, unless you've been under a rock somewhere. Actually, it makes sense if they're trying to put these books in front of children, that they're not trying to reinforce heteronormativity. They're trying to disrupt it. Now, for me as a Christian, and what I'm proposing here on this podcast, in what I'm doing here, I'm asking parents, please put your children in an environment that will reinforce heteronormativity, because heteronormativity is just a fancy word of saying normal, biblical, natural. Homosexuality is against nature. That's before you even go to the Bible to say it is an abomination before God. God equates or speaks in the same breath about homosexuality and bestiality, having sex with animals, which is to say it's just as unnatural. So heteronormativity has to be reinforced for everyone, but at the very least for Christian children. But these people who are in charge of this particular government school, and thank God for the Supreme Court to strike this down, but these people were looking to disrupt. Now, if you disrupt normativity and start saying the things that they just said here, what's to stop you from disrupting normativity in other places, such as adults should not have sex with small children, pedophilia, because that's not normal, that's not right. And there was a time in history, even in this country, that homosexuality was not normal, it was not right. If you had those feelings, you had to suppress them. You do not celebrate that. That's disgusting. But now we're at a time where it is assumed that if you're assuming that everyone is technically straight, and that there's only two genders, that you're wrong, which is to say the Bible is wrong. Of course, they are trying to disrupt normativity. Cis normativity, that's again another fancy word of saying almost the same thing. Cisgender is the opposite of transgender. And so we as Christians believe that a person is never born in the wrong body, that the doctor does not assign anything, God does. So that's cis normativity. The question is it being reinforced or disrupted? The people, they want to disrupt it. They're also asking, are power hierarchies that uphold dominant culture reinforced or disrupted? This is clerical pedagogy in application. And then the Chief Justice goes on to say, quote, in accordance with this repertoire and other criteria, the board eventually selected 13 books, LGBT plus inclusive text for use in the English and language arts curriculum from pre-K, again, from pre-K through 12th grade. At issue in this lawsuit, he says, are 5, not all 13. So at some point, the kids are being allowed to, but at issue, what caused the parents to say, no, 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 where the 5 books, and those books were approved for students in kindergarten through 5th grade. In other words, the Chief Justice continued, for children who are generally between the ages of 5 and 11. Ladies and gentlemen, the alarm bells should be going on right about now on critical pedagogy, and the fact that this is not just a theory in the ivory tower. This is being applied to you today, again, through SEL, transformative SEL, and also in other different ways, however way they can do it. There's a quote that is quoted a lot, which is attributed to Nelson Mandela, in which he is believed to have said, education is the most powerful the most powerful weapon that we can use to change the world. I don't know if Nelson Mandela was a Christian, but that statement is definitely loved by secular humanists. Now, we Christians can use that statement as well, but humanists love it, and they have taken it seriously. So now what? What is the response? My proposal is that parents and the church, now the church has to act first, in my opinion, because to the degree that the church is silent on this, parents will proceed to act like this is not an imperative. To the degree that the church continues to act like this is something that parents can decide on their own, that the church has no business interfering in this decision, well, guess what? Parents will continue to send their children to the most easiest option that is available, which is the government school system. The government school system is a cop-out for Christians, but it's the easiest one. If you tell someone to pick between having to stay home with their children, however many, and educate them themselves, you have to give up a paycheck for that. You have to give up a career for that. Most people in my generation will not if there's an option where they come right in front of their house, take the children for 7 hours and drop them back off for you for a better chunk of the year. But look at what they're doing to the children. Look what they have done to the culture. John Dewey, whom we have not even discussed, we've skipped a whole section in this episode. We went from Horace Mann and the elites of the early to mid 1800s, but John Dewey came late 1800 into the 1900s and did more damage to the government school, probably more than anyone, and basically ushered in a new era, which is the progressive education era. John Dewey is celebrated as the father of modern progressive education in America. But in my view, Paulo Freire's theories are heavily influenced by John Dewey. Now, John Dewey also played an important role in facilitating the establishment of the critical theorists here in America from Europe, the Frankfurt School. And John Dewey's progressive philosophy of education is the bucket or the vehicle in which critical pedagogy sits, which is why, in my humble opinion, people who call themselves progressives today are neo-Marxists. They are cultural Marxists, because these two merge eventually and get married together. It's a reconstruction type of education, but from a secular humanist perspective. But Christians got duped through all of this because they were promised a system that would keep the politics and all these other things out and just teach children how to read, write, and do arithmetics. And so Christians thought, and they have been trained for many years, of the possibility that education can be neutral. But education cannot be neutral. And the people that will tell you that first and foremost are the critical pedagogues. They themselves will tell you up front, no lie, education cannot be neutral. Education is one, political, and it cannot be neutral. So get that out. It's a lie. I literally have a video of Henry Giroux saying that this was an insult when the neoliberals proposed this.
The notion of neutrality, and when it's raised in education, is the worst form of politics. In itself, it's a political issue. It's a political question because it's taken a value around education in ways to hide what education is really about. I've always viewed that position as the basis for a kind of fascist politics because it hides its code for not allowing people to understand the role that education plays ideologically. the role that it plays in producing particular forms of knowledge, particular forms of power, particular kinds of social values, particular notions of agency, particular narratives about the world. It's impossible for education to be neutral. There's no such thing as a neutral education. So those who argue that education should be neutral are really arguing for a version of education that's not in which nobody's accountable. That the people who produce that form of education disappear. They become invisible because they're saying it's neutral. And so you can't identify the ideological processes, politics, modes of power at work. And that's precisely what they want.
So again, this is Henry Giroux. We already discussed him. A very influential man. He's not hiding here the fact that they, the Marxists, do not believe and they don't want you to think that education is neutral. And he's right. Education is not neutral. Now, him and I come to very different conclusions in terms of what education is for and to what ends, or even how we should go about educating. And as I said already, the definition of critical thinking, we disagree. I don't believe in deconstruction because I believe in an objective truth that cannot be deconstructed. Those people who believe in deconstruction, which is a postmodern concept, they don't believe in objective truth. They don't even think truth can be known. They don't believe in meta-narratives. They think everything is socially constructed. And so they are fighting to reconstruct society according to what they believe is equitable and just. A fool's errand, of course, that won't stop them from trying. But here again, what he's saying here about the fact that education cannot be neutral. Go.
The notion that education is neutral is to me one way of people who have dominant power making it invisible and making propaganda itself incapable of being seen.
Look, you have to give it to them. They do not hide. They're out in the open. They want you to know what they are about. So you can't ever say, no, I didn't know that the information was not there. No, the information is there. You're just not looking. So the pastors must be informed about this. The pastors must know what is being taught in these environments, and the pastors must move to act. The leadership, the elders and pastors of the church. Again, to the degree that this is not talked about, is to the degree that the people in the pews do not consider this a serious matter. To the degree that the pastor doesn't want to upset some in the pews. Now, on an average evangelical church, this is a big problem because upwards of 90%, and if we are being conservative, we can even bring it up to 85% of Christian parents, Christian households, people that go to church regularly, 90%, 85%, send their kids to government school, including the leadership in the church. Now, you know what I'm finding out increasingly, almost in most places that I look, is that government school teachers who are Christians homeschool their children. Now, I don't have the exact numbers, so I'm just going by my experience. People I meet and talk to, they themselves do not put their kids in the system. But the pastors, the elders in the churches, and most Christians put their kids in the government school system. And many of them see it as a mandate from God to put their 5-year-old, their 10-year-old in the hands of a secular humanist antichrist institution. And many of them do this because they do not realize that education is discipleship. And as our friend Henry Giroux just said, it cannot be neutral. Here is the reality. If Jesus is Lord of all of life. That means Jesus should be Lord of education and all subjects in education. And if that's the case, Christians must reclaim a Christian, distinctly Christian philosophy of education. Again, it is Christian because it has Christ and his word at the center. This is how we fight back. This is how we reclaim the lost ground and territory. This is how we usher in the revival and reformation that we desperately need in this country. There's no other way. Because if we were to have a revival today, it would be pointless because it would be temporary. If we're still going to send our children to these godless institutions from grade through 12 and sometimes even in higher education, it is impossible for me to understand why when a child graduates high school and the parents begin to look for colleges, and when a child was a very smart kid in high school and got scholarships, that you rarely ever hear anybody stand up and say, hey, don't send your kids to Harvard. Don't send your kids to Penn State. It is a cesspool of paganism. You rarely hear this. Unless, of course, the kid wants to go to seminary and become a pastor or to Bible school. Otherwise, all these are viable options. That's insane. But again, we cannot sustain revival and reformation that way. Christians must build institutions. The institutions such as Harvard, Columbia, Princeton, Yale, all these institutions were originally established as Christian institutions, starting with Harvard, 1646. Harvard was explicitly a Christian institution, and one of its founding statements says, quote, let every student be plainly instructed and earnestly pressed to consider well the main end of his life and studies is to know God and Jesus Christ, which is eternal life, and therefore to lay Christ in the bottom as the only foundation for all sound knowledge and learning. Can you imagine if Christians today was to begin again to establish more institutions with that vision? Harvard's motto, when it was established in 1636, I said earlier 1646, was founded 1636, and its original motto was Veritas Christo et Ecclesia, truth for Christ and the church. Can you imagine? I'm saying all this to say that the church, the Christian church, must reclaim her position. Again, we must build more institutions if we are to sustain a great revival and reformation. The Neo-Marxists have successfully done damage, but it's not too late. So, the people of God, please, we need to do better. We need to do different. But I am so glad I was able to do this episode. I can't wait to share it. If you have been watching thus far, thank you so much for joining me. Thank you for being supportive. Please consider sharing this message. Consider subscribing. Consider leaving a 5-star review to help this message be elevated. I will pick up from here to continue with the many different ways in which we have to be vigilant, the many different things we have to be aware of, because ultimately I want this to be a resource to those who want to know what is actually going on. So these conversations will be long, but those who will bear with me, or those who will watch and stop and watch and stop, thank you so much for doing that. With all that being said, I will end here and say, God bless you, and see you on the flip side.